Today we're going to be talking about first grade three-dimensional figures. First, take a look at this task. I want you to pause the video and complete it with your team or partner. Think about what student learning needs to look like for students to be successful. And then also think about what misconceptions your students might have when doing this task. First, let's look at the progression with the best standards. So here's kindergarten, and here's what they'll be doing in first grade. In first grade, they begin to also sort 3D figures and decompose 3D figures. They also begin to not only discuss shapes such as cubes, cones, cylinders, and spheres, but now they're also talking about rectangular prisms. And in second grade, they will then begin to categorize shapes by their attributes. So what type of models should students be seeing? Lots and lots of concrete models. Like I mentioned, this year students are learning about rectangular prisms, so you want to have conversations where they feel and touch and describe the attributes of rectangular prisms versus cubes, since they are so similar. And not only do we want them to touch these 3D shapes, but we also want to introduce some real-world examples of these 3D shapes. And then, what do you notice happens now? Don't always show shapes in the exact same configuration and orientation. You want to spin them, make them big, make them small, and ask them to identify if they are still a sphere or a prism, for example. Instruction in first grade also focuses on defining the attributes of a figure. Things like number of vertices, number of sides, edges or faces, and if it contains straight, curved, or equal length sides or edges. It's really important that students are talking about defining attributes versus non-defining attributes. Like I mentioned before, size. All spheres are not the same size, but all spheres can roll or have no edges or no sides. Now let's take a look at the task that you already solved and compare it to this task. What do you notice about how it's similar or how these tasks are different? Students who solve the task on the right may think that this task is easier because they can just look and see the cones that look familiar. Now, what if a student does this? This student probably doesn't have a strong understanding of the attributes, and they're just used to seeing cones that have a point at the top. So instead of picking all the cones, they first picked the pyramid and the cone and were confused. So what we want to make sure we do is focus on the attributes. We want students to be using the vocabulary, and they can use formal and informal language, but we want them to focus on identifying figures based on the attributes. Now in first grade, students will not only compose, but they will begin to decompose 3D figures. We want to make sure that students understand that when they are composing figures, they should not compose figures this way, but that the faces should be touching without gaps or overlaps. Here are some other examples. Now when this figure is composed, students will also be asked how many shapes of each were made to create this figure. We want them to recognize the shapes in examples like this. If students have hard time and trouble doing this, they may need to create them with concrete tools, or maybe if it's on a picture like this, you could have them shade in the different shapes so that they can see how many figures make up the composite figure. And lastly, we want to make sure that we're exposing students to recognizing 3D figures in real-world models and objects. Here, students could identify the cylinder or rectangular prism or cone that make up this tower. But remember, we also want to make sure that they are discussing the 6 faces, 6 vertices, 12 edges. That's how I know it's a rectangular prism. Now, hopefully, you feel better prepared to help students move from island to island when working with 3D figures. That's it for this Dive in 5. We'll see you on the next one.